Part 1. The Discovery. It all started with a Christmas gift, one of those popular DNA testing kits that promise to reveal your ancestry, genetic health predispositions, and connect you with relatives you never knew existed. My husband Mark had bought it for me as a stocking stuffer, knowing I'd always been curious about my genetic background. "You're always talking about your grandmother's stories about coming from Sweden," he'd said as I unwrapped it. Now you can see if she was right. At 48, I was established in my career as a high school principal, had raised 2 wonderful children now in college, and enjoyed a comfortable life with Mark in our suburban home outside of Chicago. My parents lived just 30 minutes away, still in the house where I'd grown up. Dad had retired from his accounting practice 2 years earlier, and Mom continued her part-time work as a real estate agent. We were close, having Sunday dinners together most weekends and celebrating holidays as an extended family. The DNA test seemed like a harmless bit of fun. I spat in the tube one January morning, sealed it in the prepaid package, and sent it off without much thought. Then I largely forgot about it as life took over. Budget meetings at school, planning my daughter Jenna's visit for spring break, helping my son Tyler find a summer internship. 6 weeks later, an email notification pinged on my phone. "Your DNA results are ready." That evening, I curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and opened the app. The Ancestry breakdown held a few minor surprises. I was less Scandinavian than expected, with more Eastern European heritage than family stories had suggested. The health markers showed nothing concerning. Then I clicked on the DNA relatives section, curious if I might discover some distant cousins. The app had identified several second and third cousins I'd never heard of, which was interesting but not shocking. Then I noticed something odd. The closest relative match wasn't either of my parents, but someone named James Mitchell, listed as a likely half-sibling. I frowned, assuming there must be some mistake. Neither of my parents had other children. My mother had experienced several miscarriages before and after having me, their only child. I scrolled down, expecting to see my father's name next, but it wasn't there. Instead, the app showed various cousins from my mother's side. "Mark?" I called to my husband, who was loading the dishwasher in the kitchen. "Can you look at something weird on this DNA report?" He came over, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and peered at my phone. "A half-brother? That can't be right. And Dad's not showing up as related to me at all," I added, a strange uneasiness beginning to take root. Mark's brow furrowed. "These tests aren't always accurate. Remember my coworker Dave? His showed he was part sub-Saharan African, and then when he did a different company's test, it didn't show up at all." "Maybe," I said, but something felt fundamentally wrong. I navigated through the app settings to see if there was some explanation, a testing error, a misinterpretation of results. I found nothing helpful. "You could ask your mom about this James person," Mark suggested. "Maybe there's a family connection you don't know about." The suggestion made sense, but something held me back. If there was a simple explanation, why hadn't my parents ever mentioned a James Mitchell? And why wasn't my father showing up in my DNA matches at all? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake my unease. I found myself studying my father's features when we met for our usual Sunday dinner, searching for similarities I'd always taken for granted. Dad had gray-blue eyes, while mine were brown like my mother's. His nose was aquiline, mine more rounded. He was of average height, while I'd always been tall for a woman. None of these differences had ever seemed significant before. People always said I took after my mother's side, but now they felt like clues to a mystery I hadn't known existed. I couldn't bring myself to ask direct questions. What would I even say? "Hey, Dad, the DNA test suggests you're not my biological father. Care to explain? The potential for hurt and damage seemed enormous, and I found myself procrastinating, hoping there was a logical explanation that would emerge without my having to confront the situation head-on. Instead, I decided to do more research. I created a dummy email account and reached out to James Mitchell through the DNA app's messaging system. "The app suggests we may be half-siblings," I wrote. "I'm trying to understand this result as it's unexpected. Would you be willing to share any information about your parents that might help clarify this connection?" 2 agonizing days later, a response arrived. "Hello, Sarah. I've been waiting for this day for a long time. Yes, we are half-siblings. We share a biological father named Robert Mitchell, who passed away 3 years ago. He was my father who raised me. But I discovered about 10 years ago that he had a brief relationship with a married woman in 1975, which I believe resulted in your birth. I have photos and letters that confirm this. I'd be open to meeting if you want to know more." I stared at the message for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process the implications. 1975 matched my birth year. My mother had been married to my father, or the man I'd always thought was my father, for 2 years by then. If this was true, my entire life narrative had been built on a fundamental lie. With shaking hands, I calculated that my birthday was exactly 9 months after the Christmas holidays. A memory surfaced, my mother once mentioning that she'd spent that Christmas visiting her sister in Chicago while Dad stayed home with a bad flu. A business trip, or so I'd been told. I needed answers, but I also needed time to process this earth-shattering information. My birthday was coming up in 2 weeks. The family, my parents, Mark, our kids home from college, would all be gathered at our favorite restaurant. I decided to wait until after that celebration before confronting my mother privately. But fate, or perhaps James Mitchell, had other plans. Part 2. The text. My birthday dinner started like any other family celebration. We'd reserved a private room at Giovanni's, my favorite Italian restaurant, with its warm lighting and excellent tiramisu. Dad was in particularly good spirits, telling stories about his new golf buddies. Mom seemed slightly distracted, but smiled as she handed me a beautifully wrapped package containing a cashmere sweater in my favorite shade of blue. My children presented me with a framed collage of family photos they'd secretly assembled. "To the best mom anyone could ask for," Tyler toasted, raising his glass. I smiled, pushing away the shadow that had hung over me since receiving James's message. Tonight wasn't the time for confrontations or revelations. I wanted this evening to be perfect, untouched by the storm I knew would eventually break. We had just ordered dessert when my mother's phone chimed with an incoming text. She glanced at it casually, then froze, her face draining of color. "Mom, everything okay?" I asked. Her eyes met mine, wide with what I could only describe as terror. "It's nothing, just a work thing." But her hands trembled as she set the phone down, and I noticed she'd positioned it face down on the table, something she never did. My father reached for it, a habitual gesture between them, but she snatched it away. "Catherine," he said, using her full name in a way that signaled concern. "What's going on?" She shook her head slightly, her eyes darting to me and then to my children. "Not now, Richard." The tension was palpable, destroying the easy atmosphere of moments before. I felt a cold certainty that whatever message she'd received was connected to what I'd discovered. Then my own phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry to interrupt your birthday, but your mother has been ignoring my messages for days. I'm in the restaurant parking lot. I think it's time you learned the truth about your father. I have proof." I looked up from my phone to find my mother staring at me, her expression a mixture of dread and resignation. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered. James. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow. So it was true, all of it, and my mother had known all along. "Who's James?" my father asked, looking between us in confusion. Before either of us could answer, the door to our private dining room opened. A man stood in the doorway, tall, with salt and pepper hair and brown eyes strikingly similar to my own. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, wearing a navy blazer over a collared shirt. He carried a worn leather messenger bag and looked simultaneously determined and uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice deeper than I'd imagined from our brief written exchange. "But I think we've all waited long enough for the truth." My father stood abruptly. "Who the hell are you? This is a private family dinner." The stranger, James, met my gaze directly. "That's exactly why I'm here. I'm family too." My children looked bewildered. Mark reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it in silent support. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "is this true? Is he—" My mother closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face. "Yes," she said simply. "It's true." My father looked between my mother and me, clearly struggling to understand. "Catherine, what is he talking about? What's true?" James stepped further into the room. "Mr. Parker, I believe you've spent the last 48 years raising my father's daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Part 3. The truth. "I think," Mark said, standing slowly, "that Tyler and Jenna should wait in the car." My children, now young adults, but still innocent in so many ways, looked reluctant to leave during what was clearly a pivotal family moment. But something in Mark's steady gaze convinced them. "We'll be right outside if you need us, Mom," Jenna said, touching my shoulder gently as she passed. When the door closed behind them, my father sank back into his chair, his expression stunned. "Catherine, what is he talking about? Tell me this is some kind of mistake." My mother reached for his hand across the table. "Richard, please, I never meant for this to happen, any of it." James remained standing, his presence commanding, yet somehow also respectful of the emotional tsunami he had unleashed. "I should explain why I'm here," he said. "When my father was dying 3 years ago, he confessed to me that he had another child, a daughter born to a woman named Catherine Parker, with whom he'd had a brief relationship in 1975. My father made a small wounded sound. He gave me a box of letters and photos," James continued, opening his messenger bag and withdrawing a manila envelope. "He asked me to find his daughter someday and tell her the truth, but only if it seemed right to do so. I've spent the last 3 years debating whether to honor that request." "Then why now?" I asked, finding my voice at last. "Why show up like this?" James's expression softened slightly. 3 weeks ago, I got a notification from the DNA service that I had a new close relative match. You. When you messaged me, I knew it was time." He placed several items on the table: faded photographs, handwritten letters, and what appeared to be a worn journal. "Your mother and my father met at a teachers' conference in Chicago," James explained. "Dad was presenting a workshop on innovative science education. He was divorced and Catherine was unhappy in her marriage at the time." My mother's shoulders shook with silent sobs. My father stared at the items on the table, his face ashen. "They corresponded for several months afterward," James continued. "When Catherine discovered she was pregnant, she broke off contact and returned to her husband. I thought I was doing the right thing, my mother said, her voice ragged. Our marriage was young, struggling. Richard, you were working so hard to build your accounting practice. I made a terrible mistake during a difficult time. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I wanted to save our marriage, to make things right. By lying to me for almost 5 decades, my father's voice was barely audible. By letting me believe Sarah was my daughter. You are my father, I said fiercely, surprising myself with the vehemence of my response. Biology doesn't change that. You raised me, loved me, taught me to ride a bike and balance a checkbook and stand up for myself. Nothing can erase that. My father looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears. But I'm not your father, am I? Not really. Richard, please, my mother pleaded. Sarah is right. You've been her father in every way that matters. James cleared his throat uncomfortably. I didn't come here to destroy your family, he said. My father regretted many things at the end of his life, including not knowing his daughter. But he spoke respectfully of you, Mr. Parker. He said Catherine had made the right choice for her child, giving her a stable home with a good man. My father stood abruptly. I need some air, he said, moving toward the door. Dad, wait, I called, rising to follow him. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. I don't know who I am to you anymore, Sarah. I don't know who any of us are. When the door closed behind him, the 3 of us remaining, my mother, James, and I sat in uncomfortable silence. I should have told you both years ago, my mother finally said. When you were grown, Sarah, when there was less at stake. But the longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine saying the words. She looked at James, and I should have responded to your messages. I was a coward, hoping if I ignored you, you'd go away. James nodded slowly. I understand fear. It took me months after finding Sarah on the DNA site to work up the courage to message her. That secrets have a way of emerging, whether we're ready or not. I reached for the photos on the table, snapshots of a younger version of my mother with a tall, brown-eyed man, both smiling against the backdrop of a city skyline. In one, they were bundled in winter coats, snowflakes catching in their hair. This is him? My biological father? I asked, studying the face for traces of my own. Robert Mitchell, James confirmed. He was a high school science teacher, passionate about making education accessible and engaging. He had your eyes, your laugh. He knew about me? The question felt monumental. He suspected, James said, carefully. Your mother never confirmed it, but the timing, he did the math. He respected her decision to return to her marriage, but always wondered about you. I looked at my mother, whose face was etched with guilt and sadness. Why did you never tell me? All those times I asked about our family medical history, about why I didn't look like Dad, about why I was so drawn to science when both you and Dad were humanities people. I told myself you didn't need to know, she whispered, that it would only hurt you and Richard to uncover the task. I convinced myself I was protecting you both. You were protecting yourself, I said. The words sharper than I'd intended. You were afraid of facing the consequences of your actions. She nodded, accepting the accusation. Yes, I was afraid. Afraid of losing Richard, afraid of losing you, afraid of being judged. By the time I realized the truth would have been better than decades of deception, it seemed too late to go back. The restaurant manager knocked tentatively on the door, reminding us that our reserved time was nearly up. The untouched dessert sat melting on the table, the birthday celebration forgotten. I should find Dad, I said, standing. He shouldn't be alone right now. James gathered his photographs and letters, returning them to the envelope. I'll leave these with you, he said, handing them to me. And this, he added a business card. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to tell you more about Robert, about our father, and perhaps get to know my sister. The word sister hung in the air between us, strange and yet somehow right. My mother stood as well, her composure somewhat recovered, though her eyes remained red-rimmed. Sarah, I know you must hate me right now, but please remember that everything I did, even the lies, came from love. I looked at this woman who had been my touchstone, my role model, my confidant throughout my life. The revelation of her deception had cracked the foundation of my identity, and yet, I don't hate you, Mom, I said quietly. I'm angry and hurt and confused, but you're still my mother. That hasn't changed. Outside in the parking lot, I found my father sitting on a bench, staring unseeing at the traffic passing on the main road. My children and Mark stood a respectful distance away, clearly concerned, but giving him space. I sat beside him, not touching, not speaking at first. The April evening was cool, the first stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I remember the day you were born, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. The nurse placed you in my arms, and you looked up at me with those big brown eyes. I thought they were Catherine's eyes. I never questioned, not once, that you were mine. I am yours, I said, reaching for his hand, in all the ways that matter. He turned to look at me, his face lined with age and now with pain. Do you know what hurts the most? Not that Catherine had an affair. We were young, struggling. I wasn't always the husband I should have been. Not even that another man is your biological father. It's that she lied to me, to us, for our entire lives together. How do I trust anything now? I had no answer for that. The question echoed my own feelings too closely. We sat in silence until Mark approached. Our children beside him. We should head home, he said gently. It's getting cold out here. My father nodded, rising slowly as if the weight of his 73 years had suddenly doubled. I need to talk to your mother, he said, alone. Dad, maybe you should wait until tomorrow, when things are so raw. We've had enough secrets and delays in this family. It's time for truth. However painful. As we watched him walk back into the restaurant, Jenna slipped her arm through mine. Mom, are you okay? I looked at my daughter, her compassionate eyes, her gentle spirit that reminded me so much of the man who had raised me. I will be, I said. We all will be, eventually. Tyler, pragmatic as always, was scrolling through his phone. So this James Mitchell guy, he's your half-brother? That makes him our uncle, right? The question was so unexpected, so normalizing of this extraordinary situation that I couldn't help but laugh. Yes, technically. Though we just met, so maybe uncle is premature. Mark put his arm around my shoulders. One day at a time, he said. That's all any of us can do. We drove home in 2 cars, my children with Mark, while I followed alone, needing the solitude to process the seismic shift in my understanding of myself and my family. The envelope James had given me sat on the passenger seat, unopened. Inside were pieces of a story I had never known was mine, photographs of a father I had never met, letters that might reveal why my mother had made the choices she had. At home, after the kids had gone to bed, Mark found me at the kitchen table. The contents of the envelope spread before me. Letters in faded blue ink detailed a passionate connection between 2 lonely people. Photographs showed a man with kind eyes and a serious expression, except when he smiled. Then his whole face transformed in a way that felt hauntingly familiar from my own mirror. He loved her, I said as Mark sat beside me. and I think she loved him, at least for a while. Does that make it easier or harder to accept? He asked. I considered the question. I don't know. Easier to understand, maybe. Mom was only 26, married young to a man consumed by his career. She felt invisible, and then suddenly someone saw her, really saw her. Your father, Richard, he'll need time, Mark said. This is a profound betrayal, even if it happened decades ago. I know. I gathered the letters and photos, returning them to the envelope. But he loves her. He's loved her for 50 years. That doesn't disappear overnight. And James? What will you do about him? I touched the business card he had given me. I think I'd like to know him, to hear about Robert Mitchell from someone who knew him as a father. I have a brother, Mark. I've been an only child my entire life, and suddenly I have a brother. Mark smiled slightly. Life is full of surprises, even at 48. Not all surprises involve discovering your father isn't your father, I pointed out wryly. No, but every family has its secrets, he replied. Some are just better hidden than others. That night, sleep eluded me. I found myself in our home office at 3 a.m, drafting emails I wasn't sure I would send. One to my father, expressing my unchanged love for him. One to my mother, asking for the complete truth at last. And one to James, thanking him for his courage in bringing the truth to light, and expressing cautious interest in knowing more about the man whose DNA I carried. Outside, the moon cast long shadows across our backyard. The world looked different somehow, as if the revelation of this long-buried secret had altered not just my understanding of my past, but the very texture of reality. My phone chimed with a text message, unusual for such a late hour. It was from my father. Your mother and I talked until midnight. There were tears, anger, recriminations, and in the end, love. 48 years of shared life doesn't vanish because of a mistake, however monumental. I don't know what happens next, but I know this. You are my daughter. Nothing, not DNA, not another man's biology, nothing will ever change that. I'm sorry your birthday was ruined. I love you, Dad. Tears blurred my vision as I read and reread the message. In the midst of his own pain, my father had reached out to reassure me. It was perhaps the greatest gift he had ever given me. I texted back, I love you too, Dad. Always. Then I opened the draft email to James and added a line. I'd like to learn about Robert Mitchell, but I want you to know that Richard Parker is and always will be my father. If we're going to build any kind of relationship, that needs to be clear from the start. I hit send, then closed my laptop. The world as I had known it had irrevocably changed, but perhaps what would emerge from the ruins of comfortable deception would be something authentic. A family bound not by secrets, but by truth, however difficult that truth might be. In the morning, I would wake to a new reality, one where DNA had unlocked a door I never knew existed. Beyond that door lay not just a different past than the one I had always believed in, but a future with possibilities I had never imagined. A half-brother to know, a biological father to learn about, parents to forgive and understand anew. But for now, in the quiet dark of early morning, I sat with the knowledge that family, real family, transcends biology. It's built through years of shared experiences, through love that weathers disappointments and betrayals, through the choice to remain connected even when it would be easier to walk away. And that perhaps was the most important discovery of all.